you will therefore be able to find the webinar later as we'll post it up on our YouTube. So thank you to all of you still joining us. We'll just give it a few minutes for a few more people to come through. Whilst we do, let me just remind you of why we're here and how webinars work, although I'm sure you don't need that anymore. But our speakers today from RSSB and Hills and Moran will run through measuring air quality emissions in depots. We'll have time at the end for some questions and discussion. So important, please do drop your questions through in the Q&A box, please, and we will try and answer as many of those questions as we can. We'll also be dropping some links into the chat box for you. So we'll drop through a link to the best practice guide, which we're going to discuss later. You can pick that up there. And if you want to get a copy of the slides from this presentation, please just do email Yvonne or myself after the event and we'll get those slides over to you. As I was saying, we will be popping the webinar recording onto YouTube later today. So if you do need to step away for any reason, you'll be able to look back on it later and you'll have contact details for everyone. So you can come back with any questions that we're not able to get through on the discussion. Also, just before we go live, just to remind you that we have a programme of events and webinars set out on our website. After today, our next webinar is on the 24th of February on mental health in the rail freight sector, looking at best practice and also some of the research that's been done by colleagues at RSSB around mental health in the railways and how that's impacting on rail freight. We've also got future webinars on rail freight in Wales and on data, and you can get the details of all of those on our website. Okay, we've still got one or two people drifting in, but I think that's probably time for me to hand over to our speakers today and get us started on today's substantive discussion. So I'm really delighted. We've got three brilliant speakers today talking about air quality. James Wright is going to kick us off from RSSB. James is the lead air quality specialist. Some of you will remember James coming to talk to us about the air quality strategic framework on a previous webinar. So it's great to have James back today to talk about the latest work around depots. James is joined by Philbert Chan, who's an air quality specialist at RSSB and who's been leading this work, and Tom Reed, associate air quality consultant at Hills and Moran, who's been heavily involved in the project, the work, and is going to take us through some of the findings from that and what that means. So without any further ado from me, I'm going to hand over now to James, who's going to take us through a bit of an introduction to the webinar and to the work. So James, many thanks, and over to you.
Thank you, Maggie. So welcome everyone today. I'm just going to give a quick introduction before I hand over to Tom and Philbert, who will take you through the detail of the project. So we'll give a quick welcome and introduction, a bit of project background and an overview before I hand over to Tom, and then Philbert will run us through the good practice guide. So next slide, please. So so just a quick introduction as to who RSSB are, because some of you may be from outside of the rail industry. But RSSB is the standalone safety and standards organisation in the rail sector, formed just over 20 years ago, when the need was recognised to have a standalone safety organisation post-privatisation. We're funded by our members. And we manage the standards catalogue for GB Rail and input into the development of new domestic and international rail standards. So we also manage the rail research programme on behalf of DFT. We're in the process of establishing RSSB and the Sustainable Development Team that myself and Philbert sit in as the Centre of Excellence for Sustainability. So we also look after decarbonisation, social sustainability and air quality. In terms of the background, so when I last spoke at an RFG webinar last year, we talked about the air quality strategic framework, and this was launched in the middle of 2020. And really, this is the first time the rail industry has come together and sort of set out the future path to reduce harmful pollutant emissions. And this is underpinned by a collaborative research project, and this depot's project is one of those projects that form the programme. And really what we're trying to do is make sure rail remains as one of the cleanest forms of transport in the UK. We know there's obviously a carbon advantage of rail over other ground-based transport modes, but we really want to make sure that the air quality impact is properly understood and minimised as much as we can. The air quality strategic framework is currently being updated, so the new version should be published towards the end of this month. And this will start to be a little bit more defined in terms of including targets and more defined commitments for the industry. And then next slide. So in terms of the background to this project, when we first started looking at air quality in rail 3 years ago, there were obvious areas of concern, like busy passenger stations. We knew that there was a bit of an issue in Birmingham New Street, for example, and some stakeholders from the freight sector started to really highlight that we didn't know enough about train depots, especially urban train depots, and what impact they might be having on urban air quality. So we established this project to provide an accurate sort of picture of air quality at train depots. As Tom will run you through the details, but we covered 3 passenger depots and 3 freight depots. And we also, based on the study and the findings of the study, we produced guidance for the industry on what measures you can take to improve air quality. And the main focus, it's worth pointing out that this is more on public health and nuisance rather than occupational health. But where we did find 1 or 2 sort of areas of concern in terms of occupational health, we did highlight that to the depot operators. And then next slide. And then in terms of the scope of work, so as I say, yeah, we had 6 depots, 3 from freight and 3 from the passenger sector. We monitored air quality within and at the perimeter of the selected depots. And then in order to sort of build up an inventory of emissions, we undertook a study of all the various activities that would create pollutant emissions that we're interested in, which is mainly PM and NOx, and developed a high resolution emissions inventory. And Tom will show you or guide you through some of the examples of how those were built up. And then based on that, we use sort of industry standard techniques. When I say industry standards, it's the sort of air quality industry standard techniques to model the dispersion of those emissions and see what impact they had on local air quality. And then based on the surveys that had taken place, we looked at possible mitigation measures. And then, yeah, we developed a good practice guide, which I'll put a link into the chat later on so everyone can download that. And I think that's it. So thank you very much.
Thanks, James. And make sure the slides are working. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of what we did in terms of the project, the findings of the freight depots, and then I'm going to touch briefly on the study replication element. And Phil will then follow on with covering the good practice guide and some of the mitigation elements that we covered afterwards as well. So initially, I'm just going to talk briefly about local air quality in terms of what we consider in terms of the objectives. So we took the UK standard air quality objectives as the principal guidance for assessing this. So for NO2, PM10 and PM2.5, those were the objectives that we utilised. Looking particularly at the freight depots, which we considered. So I've taken, I know James indicated we covered 3, but I've taken 2 just for ease of this presentation. So we looked at Leeds Midland Road and Leeds Valley Farm Road, which are both freight depots and actually serve one another in Leeds. As a background, Leeds City Council have a number of existing air quality management areas for the exceedance of nitrogen dioxide. Obviously, they're indicated in the image on the right-hand side of the screen there, with the closest to Midland Road being approximately 2 kilometres to the west, and to Valley Farm Road is 3.3 kilometres. So these AQMAs have been designated for nitrogen dioxide, and within those, the existing air quality monitoring data has identified exceedances. It's worth pointing out that the monitoring data in the vicinity of these two depots actually was compliant with the objective, and that included some continuous monitoring for particulate matter as well. So I'm going to move on to the main depot sources. And looking at Leeds Midland Road to start with, we identified the rail activities, the road traffic elements of that, the non-road mobile machinery and the combustion plant. That included, so for example, on the rail side of things, we looked at the rail lines themselves, so the locomotives coming in and out of the depot and utilising the lines, and also the rail lines that were confined to the sheds. So the sheds incorporated fuel sheds or maintenance for both long-term and short-term servicing. The road traffic element was considered for usually the employee car parks and things like that, and also the routing for the non-road mobile machinery. And the combustion plant, as you can see from Leeds Midland Road, is in the centre of the screen there, indicated by the red dot. So that was usually for the provision of heating and hot water. Just taking a minute to skip over the slide. So the main sources on Leeds Valley Farm Road were significantly less than Midland Road. So here we only looked at the rail, road traffic and the non-road mobile machinery and the car park. There were no sources of emission from the buildings within this shed. So typically at Leeds Valley Farm Road, the locomotives come from Midland Road and then join up onto the tracks in the northwestern part of the site. So looking at the air quality monitoring side of things, we installed continuous monitoring air quality equipment at 2 locations. So, two locations. We installed 2 units. The first was at a background position across the site, and that was in a position for 3 months. We also utilised another continuous air quality monitoring unit, and this was in order just to give us a glimpse of the emissions or the operational emissions from various key activities within the depot. So at Leeds Midland Road, that incorporated the fuel shed, the maintenance shed and the wheel lathe shed, where a large proportion of their key sort of internal operations happen. We also installed a number of diffusion tubes, so predominantly looking at nitrogen dioxide, and they were installed along the perimeter fencing and at the key and some of the key activities within the depot. So we typically co-located the diffusion tubes with the continuous monitors. Leeds Valley Farm Road, again, we installed 2 continuous monitors. The first one was at the rear of the workshop, which was located as the background position, and the second was at the locomotive inspection deck, which was on the eastern side of the depot. Typically, at this depot, we didn't need to move the second unit around to capture other activities, because the key activity at this depot was captured both from the movement of vehicles and from the arrival and the idling of the locomotives and the inspection deck. We also installed a number of diffusion tubes along the perimeters, as we did at the other depots, and we also captured some of the key activities that were occurring across the depot as well, and these were in place for a period of 3 months. So in terms of the key findings for the depots, so I've summarised these that were reflective of all of the depots, but in reality, they're very much pertinent to the freight depots as well. So the measured air quality concentrations were typically highest within the sheds. So that would be the short-term servicing sheds, where locos would typically come in, be serviced and often left in idling or in running, compared to the long-term or the heavy maintenance sheds, where locos could be in there for anything up to a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, depending upon the exam that they were being undertaken. Concentrations within open-ended fuel sheds were typically high. This was, again, typically because of the idling of the locomotives. These were obviously higher than those within sealed servicing and maintenance sheds. When no servicing or maintenance or refueling took place, these concentrations were typically higher at the along the rail lines, usually at the entrance of the depots where locomotives were often idle before they were sent across to various places for storage on the sites. So now moving into the air quality modelling side of things. So we're looking at Leeds Midland Road to start with. On the Leeds Midland Road side of things, so we had to, as James indicated, we produced an emissions inventory, and that was capturing all of the sources on the depot. So for each of the emission sources, there we had transport. We classify them as transport, domestic and industrial plant, and industrial machinery. So under transport, that incorporated buildings, and when I say buildings, that means the locomotives that were operational within those buildings, car park, rail, external to the buildings, the road, and the road transport. Domestic and industrial plant reflected any combustion plant that was on the site, so gas-fired boilers or diesel boilers, usually for the provision of heating and hot water, and then obviously non-road mobile machinery. So at Leeds Midland Road, the greatest contributor to emissions, both NOx, PM10 and PM2.5, was from the transport element, in particular the rail. At Leeds Midland Road, they're typically using Freightliner Class 66 and Class 67 locomotives. Second to this was the operation of the combustion plant for the heating and hot water provision for the depot. At this particular depot, the actual plant in question was a circa 15-20 years old, and actually since this assessment has been done was on the agenda for replacement anyway. And then thirdly, in terms of non-road mobile machinery, this had the smallest contributor on this depot. Move on to the next slide. So looking at the diurnal emissions side of things, we looked at the daytime emissions for PM10, NO2, for NOx, PM10 and PM2.5, and also the nighttime emissions. For Leeds Midland Road, you can see there's very little diurnal change between the emissions between daytime and nighttime. This is typically because the majority of activity is relatively consistent. Key times of the day, in particular in the morning, in the afternoon, is when locomotives typically enter and leave the depot, but a large proportion of the servicing and maintenance regimes that occur on this depot are 24-hour operations. And obviously alongside that, in things like the combustion plant is a 24/7 operation as well to provide that provision of heating and hot water. Slide to the next one, please. So we took those emission maps and the emissions inventory, and we created a series of pollution maps. These pollution maps covered NO2, PM10 and 2.5. And as you can see from the pollution, the key contributors are in the center of the depot, and that center of the depot is identified where the on-site combustion plant is and where the fuel shed and the main maintenance and servicing sheds are located. Obviously, on what you will notice between the emission plots on the previous slide and this and the pollution plots is the rail lines that run along the southwestern boundary are less predominant on this. We skip forward. The next thing we looked at was correlation with local concern. So local concern was based upon two things: the sensitivity of any land use classes beyond the depot boundary, and also any correlation with any complaints data that was provided or any complaints data that had been received by the depot. So we classified we took the distance from the boundary as 200 meters, and we classified those areas as high, medium, and low sensitivity. This was based upon the classification in the Environmental Protection UK and IAQM land use planning guide as a basis. As you'll note from Leeds Midland Road, the majority of those land use classifications surrounding the site in particular were of medium to low sensitivity, with some high sensitivity receptors located to the south and into the north. The medium sensitivity receptors that you note are typically industrial office uses in here. The predominant wind direction within Leeds is from the west and the southwest, and therefore the emissions from the depot are typically transported to the east. At this particular depot, total annual mean NO2 concentrations did exceed the air quality objective of 40 beyond the depot boundary, and total PM10 and 2.5 beyond the depot boundary were below the thresholds of 40 and 25 respectively. Next slide. So the key findings at Leeds Midland Road were that the rail activities, both the rail lines and the operational, were of a key source of NOx, PM10 and 2.5, and also, more importantly, as noted on the pollution plots, was the identification of the combustion plant, which provides heating and hot water. There were very small variations in total emissions between the daytime and nighttime. Daytime were very slightly higher due to the arrival and departure of vehicles early morning and late afternoon. Total NO2 concentrations exceeded the objective beyond the depot boundary. That was on an annual basis. However, given the nature of those uses to the east, so the industrial and the office type, the short-term objective in that respect was more applicable. So there was some further work done on the short term. In isolation, PM10 and 2.5 concentrations beyond the depot boundary were all below the relevant objectives. Just going to cover Leeds Valley Farm Road now in the same cover. So for the emissions inventory on Leeds Valley Farm Road, we took the same approach. We gathered all of the information regarding all of the sources. So again, we classify them down into transport, domestic and industrial machinery. And you'll note that the key difference here between Leeds Valley Farm Road and Midland Road is that the proportion of emissions are highly concentrated towards the operation of an NRMM in this case. That's because at Leeds Valley Farm Road, they have between 5 and 6 arrivals per day, whereas at Midland Road, that is effectively a servicing and maintenance depot. Therefore, they have a substantial number of movements per day coming both in and out of the depot, and obviously testing of or post-examination testing of locos as well. So in this case, non-road mobile machinery contributed to about 78% of the total depot emissions for NOx, 56 for PM10 and 73 for 2.5. You will note in terms of the transport element that the rail contributed to the greatest part of the transport emissions. Next slide, please. So looking at the diurnal profile, you can see between NOx the daytime and the nighttime for both NOx, PM10 and 2.5, there is very little, if any, diurnal variation. The non-road mobile machinery in the locomotives arrive throughout the 24-hour period. So therefore, some days there were 3 during the day and 3 at night, sometimes 2 in the day and 3 during the night. So typically, across a typical day, the emissions were largely consistent between the daytime and the nighttime. On that slide, so this is fine. I was going to indicate on that slide, you can identify the emissions from the rail lines, which run from the northwest to the southeast. And you can also identify the routing around where the non-road mobile machinery was tracking on the sort of the red line, which comes down from the northeast around the southern or the southwestern boundary. Next slide, please. So converting that into pollution concentration maps. Again, we looked at NO2, PM10 and 2.5. The top ones are total concentrations and the bottom 3 images are process contributions. Considering the NO2 total concentrations, you can see that the highest concentrations are limited to the center of the site, and the same with PM10 and 2.5. And that's typical in terms of where the key routing is in the arrival and the island of the locomotives, which is on that sort of red, the more red section, to be honest, is where the highest pollution concentrations were identified. And that's reflected in the process contributions as well. Next slide, please. From the correlation of local concern indicates again a lot of the sensitivity of the land use classes around the outside were low to medium, with a very small proportion of highly sensitive to the west. Again, based in Leeds, the wind is predominantly from the west, and therefore the majority of the emissions from the depot that will be taken beyond the depot boundary occurred in the eastern side of the site. In isolation, the depot itself, the total concentration of NO2, PM10 and 2.5 were beyond the depot boundary or below the air quality objectives. So there were some exceedances within the depot boundary itself. Next slide, please. So the key findings at Leeds Valley Farm Road were that the key sources of emissions were from the rail, on the rail lines, and more predominantly than non-road mobile machinery. There was little to no diurnal variation between the daytime and nighttime, and that's sort of expected based on the operational profile of the depot. And in isolation, NO2, PM10 and 2.5 beyond the depot boundary were also below the air quality objectives. Next slide, please. So that was obviously a very brief overview of the key findings from 2 of the depots. There's a lot more to show. We obviously got quite a short limited on time. So now it's going to move on to the study replication guide, which was formed post modeling side. So obviously we've covered there's an air quality monitoring element, and there's also an air quality modeling. So this study replication guide that we produced, there's no requirement specifically to use the equipment that we selected. However, the unit that we used was the Aeroqual AQS1, which continuously monitors nitrogen dioxide and particulate PM10 and 2.5. There's also, if necessary, you can install other equipment to pick up other pollutants if that's what you're looking at. But they're the 3 key ones that we need to be considering. At the outset, you need to determine obviously the number of monitors that you require. 2 would be the minimum, which is what we utilised. And we installed 1 at a background position, which I located away from any key sources on the depot. And the second unit, or any subsequent units after that, can be installed at key depot activity locations for a period of 3 months, which is what we utilised. Where possible, you should continue to take wind speed and direction data, so you have site-specific information, and data should be collected at 1 minute intervals to enable good interrogation of the data sets. Next slide, Philip. Onto the passive monitoring side. So we specifically looked at nitrogen dioxide in this. Obviously, there are other options that you can take forward as well. The diffusion tubes in our case were installed on the perimeter and other key activity locations. We undertook this analysis for 3 months, and each tube was changed every 4 weeks in accordance with the LAQM guidance. It was then sent back to a UCAS accredited lab for analysis. As I said, the survey we undertook was for 3 months. However, that can be undertaken for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. Obviously, the longer the survey, the better the data collection, and sort of the less chance for any adverse or odd data to come back. The tubes are quite easily deployed. They don't require any power, and they're very sort of cheap to buy. So it's a very good way of understanding some baseline NO2 information around the depot. Next slide. So moving into the air quality modelling side, I've basically taken a screen grab of the information that we utilised effectively to undertake the modelling. So again, these have been broken down onto a category basis from transport, domestic and industrial machinery, and then split further down into a type. So under the transport element, we have road, traffic, car park emissions, rail and buildings, and then combustion plant and non-road mobile machinery. As you can see, there's quite an extensive amount of data we've had to obtain. For the road, obviously looking at speed limits and daily traffic into the site, HGV routes and any vehicle routes. Car parking information was based on typical working days. We did car park counts to understand how many car parking spaces there were at each of the depots, but also how many of those were utilised at a typical working day. The rail element was obviously the most in-depth in terms of analysis and data collection. We had to obtain depot workflows and yard plans, servicing sheets, any idling policies, details of shunting locomotives that passed through the depot and what class they were, and what notch they operate through the depot, the power in their engine use and power. And then in terms of inventory information, there was fuel use and consumption, delivery, hours of operating. So as you can see, there's a very extensive data collection process that has been undertaken. This information was gathered through a number of site visits, so observed information from our point, but also obviously video conferencing, telephone conferencing with depot managers, site managers, and various other people in the depot. And then in terms of combustion plant, that was about technical specifications and operational profiles, location of plant and flues. And then non-road mobile machinery was about obtaining technical specifications for the units, the emissions data, principal routing and operating schedules that they were utilised. So if you go to the next slide. So one of the key tools that we developed for use within our modeling was to understand the depot throughput model. So we effectively created a spreadsheet, which on the left-hand side indicates all of the lines in the depot. So each throughput model is different per depot. It reflects the number of lines and what those lines are used for. And across the top, you have the operational time, and that was a 24-hour operational time. So this particular one just shows the daytime one because it runs from 6 o'clock till 6. Oh no, sorry, all the way through. And what we effectively did is we marked up all of the locomotives based upon the service and information and the train logs for the day. And we logged which locomotives came in, where they went, what happened to them, how long they were idling for. Did they go into servicing sheds? Did they go to the wheel lathe? Did they go to the fuel shed, etc.? And this was all plotted out, and the arrows on there indicate and which line the locomotive arrived and where it ended up, how long it stood there, and then where it moved. Yellow indicates a period of non-operation, i.e. the engine was switched off, and the colours indicate the different locomotive types and when they were idling or operational under movement. This was quite an extensive process, so we produced one of these for each depot for both the daytime and the nighttime, and then a 24-hour operation one as well. It was a very useful tool, actually, in being able to understand where the locomotives went. It's probably important to point out that we had months and months of logs for each of the depots, and we effectively looked at all of that information and created a typical profile through the day for those locomotives. Next slide, please. In terms of the approach and methodology to the air quality modelling, after the data collection period and the pulling together of those depot throughput plans, we used EMIT, so CERC, Cambridge Environmental Research Consultants, EMIT, which is an atmospheric emissions inventory tool, to create the emissions inventory and the fuel inventory. We also utilise that to support the diurnal variation. The outputs from EMIT are capable of being output into the format which can then be put into ADMS Urban, which is effectively the pollution dispersion tool that we utilised. And basically, in ADMS Urban, you provide your inputs alongside your receptor points, etc., in the gridded outputs, and gridded inputs, and then the outputs that come from that were then utilised and deposited into QGIS, which was the GIS tool that we utilised to provide the image outputs for the heat mapping and the concentration plots alongside the land use sensitivity and the emission source locations. Obviously, there was a number of conversion toolkits that were required because into the model, into EMIT and into ADMS, and out comes NOx. Obviously, we needed to produce NO2 plots. So therefore, we use a DEFRA emission factor toolkit for the creation of those emissions for the vehicular side of things. For the vehicular side of things, to convert NOx to NO2, we use DEFRA's toolkit. And then there was a bespoke NOx to NO2 rail conversion kit, which ATHE UK, RSSB and Hilson Ram worked together to develop. And that was to convert the NOx and NO2, NOx emissions from the rail side of things into NO2 based upon each locomotive type. And then we used the Environment Agency's guidance for converting combustion plant. Next slide, Philip. And then, Phil, I'll pass back across to yourself now on the mitigation in practice.
Thanks very much, Tom. Yes, so after the study for each particular depot, in understanding the emissions and their likely impact on local air quality, then the project started to look at what are the possible mitigations to try to improve, whether either to reduce the emissions or to reduce the impact on local air quality. So yeah, so this exercise has been done for each selected depots, and some recommendations have been made on this basis. One point to emphasize is that all the recommendations are purely focused on the potential air quality impact. The process itself has not taken into account like cost, feasibility, and clearly when it comes to the implementation, the cost benefit analysis or the feasibility analysis will be an important element to take into account as well. So after the considerations of mitigation measures, we have summarized all these into an industry good practice guide. As you can see on the screen, there's a screenshot for the cover page, and I know that James has actually just put on our chat box, which that you can find a link to download the relevant documents. So this industry good practice guide is divided into various sections. It provides readers a bit of brief introduction or background information about what are the applicable air quality legislation standards both within the depot and outside the depot. And then a bit of background information about the health impact from exposure to poor air quality and also on to the natural environment as well. It also made reference to other existing air quality guidance, which Tom has also mentioned a few just now. And then coming to the actual good practice guidance, the measures are broadly categorized into those that are applicable to all depot types. And then there are also some specific measures for freight and passenger depots. So in terms of the key points on the sort of general mitigation measures that are being recommended in the guidance, the first most obvious one is about the idling reduction plan. Excuse me. Yeah, as probably everybody knows, during the idling, there's in terms of the emission rates is the highest, and also because the locomotives are stationary, so it can potentially cause quite a bit of impact. There is a need, where possible, to create a plan to reduce or even prohibit the diesel idling within the depot, and also where it is not possible, it is recommended that there's a need to reduce the idling time where you can. And for specifically for freight, there are some alternative measures, and these are actually covered in the RDG guidance that was published separately, and the reference, our good practice guide has made reference to this guidance as well. Another key element within the various depots that we have studied are the heating and hot water combustion plant. As you can see in the previous slides, they may not be the principal source of emissions, but they can still make notable contribution, especially for those plants which run 24/7. So one key thing is that for each depot, one can consider whether or not this kind of continuous operation is needed, or whether or not a time operation could be implemented to obviously to cut the operation time and thus the emissions. And alternatively, especially for depots with old combustion plant, you can consider whether any emissions abatement technology like the SCR system, the selective catalytic reduction system, could be retrofitted. And also for plant which is sort of towards the end of their life cycle, when you consider taking up new plant, then do you seriously consider the zero emissions or low emission alternatives? NRMM, the non-road machinery, non-road mobile machinery, again, is another notable contributors to emissions within the depots. Obviously, the cost and performance of these machineries it would be a key factor to consider, but also their emissions should also be considered during their procurement process. Electric alternative could be considered. We know that this is not always possible, but at the same time, this area is actually developing quite rapidly. And there are some good examples like those being adopted by the HS2 project, so that there could be some learning that could be transferred from there to various depots as well. In terms of monitoring, there are basically two key items or two elements of monitoring. So first of all, related to the idling reduction that I mentioned before, there will be beneficial element in terms of monitoring the idling reduction plan being implemented, because it will help you to track how effective this is, and whether or not there are certain elements that you can go further to reduce the idling. Air quality monitoring, as Tom has suggested in the study replication guide as well, would be a very good element and instrument to basically to track your mitigation measures. Especially you need to know whether or not the measures implemented are effective or not. And a few sort of freight specific mitigation measures that has been highlighted in the good practice guide. I think traditionally there is quite a bit of reliance on diesel power generators, especially for backup power. While this can be understood from the logistical side as well, but there is, where possible, the use of diesel power generators could be reduced by, for example, established an existing electrical connection where possible. And obviously that there are many cases this may not be possible. Then alternative measures to reduce emissions from such combustion plants like generators could be considered. Like, for example, choosing units that are compliant with the latest emissions limits, proper maintenance of such unit, and actually one thing that is often being omitted is the appropriate siting of the generator flues. Because the flue itself, the design, siting, height, etc., could have a very considerable influence on how the emissions from such generator impact on the local air quality. And another element is known as dust management. So, for instance, there are some depots, say for example, depots handling aggregates, etc., would naturally generate a lot of dust. There is existing guidance from the IAQM, which is about the handling of dust or even construction activities to reduce emissions and air quality impact. And finally, about the road traffic, and not naturally depots attracts lots of road traffic. Various depots could consider developing various travel plans for their logistical deliveries or even for their staff going or commuting, so it's the kind of workplace travel plan as well. So in order for us to sort of quantify how effective these mitigation measures can potentially be, the project has selected two depots to demonstrate the theoretical improvement. There are two depots being selected. Within the project, it was the passenger depots that have been selected: Leeds Neville Hill and Bow. And for Leeds Neville Hill, a hypothetical scenario has been chosen to look at how the combustion plant, the existing combustion plant, I think it's gas fired or oil fired, could be replaced by renewable alternatives like electric alternatives. So effectively, there could be very little or virtually no emissions from such unit. And then for Bow, again, similarly, is the removal of the combustion plant and all the diesel powered NRMM with electrical alternatives. Based on these hypothetical scenarios, some polluting concentration plots have been produced, and you can see that there are some clear differences between the pre-mitigation and the post-mitigation scenarios. For instance, in Leeds Neville Hill, naturally the hotspots where the combustion plant is, sort of towards the right hand side or east end of the depot, will have been gone. And similarly for Bow, you can see that on the left there is lots of emissions, and the resulting polluting concentrations are spreading across the depots because of the movements of the NRMM. But if they are being replaced by some electrical alternatives, then those will be gone. What remaining is still a bit of emissions from the locomotives themselves. Here is a bit of a link to the various study reports that you can download, and as James has already shared on the slide on the chat box as well. Just a couple of slides before we finish our presentation. Just to mention very quickly, so following on from this project, we have planned two potential future projects to make use of the findings from what we've got so far, and to push forward to find out what else we can do to look at the bigger picture. So the first one is a research project, again emphasizing these potential projects that we're considering, and that is to basically to look at the potential mode shift from other transport to rail. And the focus is on the various major rail hubs, including, for example, a freight depot, to look at if there is more and more um, passenger movement or freight movement to rail, how this could impact on local air quality and the overall emissions. And then a second project, which is less researchy, but more about the implementation, is actually to carry out a cross-industry project to deliver reduction idling. Because reduction idling, while it sounds simple, but in practice is actually quite difficult because there are various operational constraints and other elements to consider. And the project is aiming to bring across the various stakeholders within the rail industry to come together and try to push this forward and basically to form some standardized approach or produce some best practice guides that can be replicated within the industry. I think that's the very last slide indeed. And so I'll stop presenting for now, but I think we can either go to the Q&As or the questions raised in the chat box, and we'll take it forward from there.
Thank you very much, and thank you all three. It's absolutely fascinating. I'm not sure who's the other slides have gone. Brilliant, thank you. So we've got a few questions we've got one question in the Q&A, and I think a few in the chat. If those listening have got any more questions, please do pop them in because we've got some time. But let me take chair's prerogative and ask one or two before we start. You know, when we I think when we started talking about air quality, you know, James, a few years ago, obviously one of the things that I was certainly concerned about and still am is you know, the impact of sensible measures like clean air zones and air quality management zones on the ability to operate freight in terminals. And I think we've come a huge way through work like this in understanding more about how we measure our impact at a local level, how we manage that at a local level. And of course, in that same time, we've seen more clean air zones being more ultra low emission zones or charging zones, but they've been very much still focused on roads. What's your sense of how quickly rail's going to get scooped into those zones?
So yeah, I'll talk about a couple of projects, Maggie. So in terms of understanding rail's interaction with AQMAs and clean air zones, and also its potential emissions impacts, we have developed a mapping tool. So essentially it's a network-wide inventory of rail emissions, and that has allowed us to get a better picture of where we may have emissions hotspots in relation to AQMAs, etc. And we've carried out some initial studies to use our higher resolution emissions estimates and see what impact we might be having in AQMAs, and we're going to probably expand that work. In general, I mean, there's not a number of different research projects that we've undertaken in it, and it seems that rail's air quality risk is really beginning to focus on certain stations and on board certain trains. But that's not to say that, you know, the book is closed on, you know, impacts we might have line side in urban locations. So we're looking to go into more detail to understand like the impacts of you know, idling locos in urban locations. But also we have an ongoing project looking at incentivization. So the real driver behind that, and it was suggested by Eversholt Rail, was to essentially come up with a study of how rail could incentivize emissions reduction. So essentially getting ahead of the game rather than waiting for different local authorities to start to charge different charges. You know, for example, a freight loco going half the length of the country could hypothetically be charged by different local authorities in different ways. So the idea of this project is to highlight potentially other ways that emissions reductions could be incentivized where they're needed.
And the mapping, James, is that something that people can come to you and ask for advice on to see whether if they've got particular areas that they're concerned about? Yes,
so we can provide any data that's needed, but it's accessible to the rail industry. So we have a number of people within rail who have access. So you can get in touch with us if you're from the rail industry and you would like to get access. But it's a very useful tool. It breaks down by by specific area. It's actually by timing point location, and you can drill down and look at all the rolling stock that's operating there and what its emissions impact is predicted to be.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm not giving up yet, though we have got some questions coming in, so thank you. But I'm going, Tom, a question for you. Some parts of, when you talked about how you've done it in the study replication, some parts of that look really easy and some parts of that look really complicated. Which is it? And, so if you're somebody looking at your estate of terminals thinking, actually, perhaps we'd better do something here, what's the easy way into this?
Honestly, is probably to get an air quality consultancy involved, because a lot of the software that was used is license-based, so a lot of consultants already have that in-house. But it's also understanding obviously there's a lot of data collection around that. It's actually understanding how to use that data and implement it into EMIT and into ADMS, and obviously getting subsequent outputs and plotting those through QGIS or any GIS platform that you choose to utilize. Obviously, in part, there's different ways of doing things. I mean, the approach that we took and the replication guide is based upon, that's only applicable in theory to the six depots that we looked at. Some depots might have to tweak things and do things slightly differently, reflective on their particular operations. But it's quite a complicated process to go through, and you need a good background of air quality and understanding of how dispersion modeling and emission inventory tools work to do so.
I think if somebody's looking at their estate of, based on the work that's been done and the information we've provided, if you looked across your estate of terminals, the things you'd be looking for would obviously be density of activity, but also adjacent population and the nature of that adjacent population, presumably, to help you find the ones that were probably the biggest potential concern, I guess.
Absolutely. If you're looking across, say, 10 different depots, you would probably want to look at those where you had obviously greatest number of sensitive receptors that surround the bounds of the depot. So on that sort of high, medium, low classification of sensitivity, you'd probably want to look at those where there's a greater proportion of highest sensitivity receptors to start with, to understand how that affects those. And when I say high sensitive receptors, that's people, schools, residential receptors where people can be there for a greater period of time than offices or industrial type parks. And then the next thing you would probably want to look at is frequency of locomotives, depending upon the type of depot you're looking at, and if you're looking at aggregate facilities, that will be obviously the use of HGVs or NRMM and those intermodal stations as well. So I guess it's characterizing and probably doing a risk-based assessment on a number of items, I would say, to start with, to work out where you should start and prioritize. Okay, I'm trying to say.
And Phil, but one for you, because you won't get away. In terms of, sort of gas and combustion equipment in terminals, I mean, obviously what we're seeing there is, significant local concentrations. Is that also contributing to staff exposure limits? I mean, I know we've not looked at that particularly in the context of these studies, but would that be something that did, or does it disperse out the way?
Yeah, it really depends, because there are so many various factors that could affect the exposure by staff. So it will be difficult, if not impossible, to provide a generic answer. But I think we've actually seen in some depots, or actually stations, that they have combustion plants built within a building, with the exhaust within the building as well. And I mean, those would be the obvious thing to look into, because that could potentially cause problem. But yeah, I think on an individual, in terms of determining the staff exposure, especially against the sort of workplace exposure limit, it needs to be looked at in a case-by-case basis.
Lovely, thank you. All right, let me turn to the questions that are coming in. I'm going to go to the people who correctly put them in the Q&A box first. So well done, Julian. How were the emissions from trains passing on running lines outside the depots distinguished from on-site emissions?
Do you want me to that one, Phil?
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah. So the actual purpose of the study was to determine the emissions from the depot itself. So effectively what we looked at was what was operating within the depot, and then calculated the emissions based upon that. So one thing that we actually did discuss post-project, wasn't it, Phil? But really was about how we account or look to account for any future work for those emissions beyond the depot boundary. But the purpose of this project was purely just to look at what those depots generated within the confines of that boundary line, and how that dispersed into beyond that depot boundary to those receptors. So specifically, there was no consideration of emissions from locos running alongside the depot boundary in some cases.
But presumably, I think the point of Julian's question was that the fact that the background, the background emission levels aren't zero was factored into the mapping that you did. Yeah,
absolutely. So the background concentration that we utilised for the depot will have accounted for the existing contributions outside, but obviously not specifically down to an individual locomotive going past, but as a generic background data which was taken from DEFRA.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. Was your emissions inventory done based on the measurements you took? In which case, how do you attribute measured emissions to specific sources, or was it done top-down emission factors? I don't understand that question.
Top down. The answer is top down. So we didn't do, for example, we didn't do source testing of a particular locomotive. We took all the technical information that was available for those locomotives, including the fuel and the emissions source, the emissions factors that had been developed prior to the T1190 project, which Phil or James will be able to elaborate on a little bit more. But we had a series, effectively an exceedingly large spreadsheet, which provided all of the locomotives that we were looking at under each different notch and power setting. And for those, there was an emission factor for notch 1, notch 2, notch 3, however many notches were that powertrain applies. And those emissions were factored into EMIT on a 10 metre by 10 metre grid after we plotted all of the rail lines, the buildings themselves. So it wasn't done by source measurement, it was done from a top-down emission factor basis.
Okay, thank you. Okay, your real-time air quality analyzers, were these EU UK reference type or low-cost sensors?
So they weren't EU UK reference type analyzers such as the ones you would see at roadsides, typical sort of local authority type units, and they weren't necessarily low-cost sensors. They were, we used the Aeroqual AQS1, which is MCERT certified, which was a requirement for the project for PM10 and PM2.5.
Okay. All right, just one or two left. So one here, when promoting new freight terminals, local opposition is usually around noise emissions and increased local road traffic. Could this research be used to demonstrate the level of emissions against equivalent brownfield uses? So are we better or worse than alternative uses such as supermarkets or retail, for example? So I suppose the core of that question is around the sort of planning opposition that is often cited, and how could having a better understanding of your air quality emissions help you in that, I think, is probably at the core of it.
Yeah, I think, again, it's probably difficult to generalize, but what I would say is that the study could form a good basis on how to assess all the emissions from a proposed depot, and then compare that with whatever is being proposed as an alternative supermarket or retail outlet, because the variables really is how, what sort of scale we are comparing and what sort of traffic would be generated by the various options. So I think it would be difficult to give a generalized answer on this.
Yeah, okay.
Just to quickly say, the underlying emissions factors we've developed should give a much fairer picture of rail emissions. Yeah. I think previously the Class 66 NOx emissions factor was found to be 3 times too high because of a calculation error, and that had traditionally been used. So at least the current estimates we've used, as well as the guidance that Tom's developed, should give a much more accurate picture.
Yeah, and that's, James, for me, and we're drawing to the end now, but in terms of time, but that to me is absolutely what this is about, that whether it's a planning issue for a new terminal, or whether it's a complaint from an adjacent neighbour, or whether it's the imposition of some kind of clean air zone or charge, the more information we've got and the more we're able to demonstrate that we're taking the appropriate action to mitigate, the better we will be to deal with that. And we all know that rail freight is, much more environmentally friendly than road freight in the round, but actually that won't necessarily get us off the hook on a local situation. So, I've been really encouraged by this work, and its depth of analysis, but also the sort of the pragmatic outcomes, which, you know, even if you don't want to go off and measure the air quality emissions in your terminals, reducing idling, having a travel to work plan, checking out your gas boilers, and, you know, building up the case for different sorts of non-road mobile machinery as you would come through a replacement cycle, are really clear findings from this. You know, it seems to me that those are the sorts of areas that the best practice ought to take forward, even if people don't want to get into a more detailed measurement and management process, and some no doubt will and some don't. So look, we are on 12 o'clock. I think you know, there are one or two questions we didn't quite get to, but I think we've talked about them in the round. So thank you to those of you who did post your questions. It falls to me just to thank our speakers very much for a fascinating presentation, and indeed, you know, a really intelligent and well-researched body of work behind it, which I think has got real reach into what we do into our operations at terminals. So thank you all both for today and for that. As we've said, you've got the links, folks, in the chat. If you don't extract them from the chat in time, then they are also linked through in the slides, which you can get. Just drop me an email or Yvonne an email. And if you are an RSSB member and on Spark, you can track them down for yourself anyway. But if not, we can certainly signpost them to you. And I'm sure colleagues on the call today are happy to take any questions directly if you didn't feel that you got an answer today, or you think of something after the event. But apart from that, it just falls to say a huge thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for those who've presented and those who've asked questions. Do look out for our upcoming webinars, and do keep engaging on air quality with the RSSB and ourselves, because it certainly continues to be a really important topic. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks, Marie.
Thank you. Bye.